Thank you. And the next question is by Assembly Member Pigeon, please.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to ask my first question to the Deputy Mayor, given your contribution at the start, because Section 1.4 of the original bid document promised these 4 great legacies: sport, community, environment and economy. I really want to try and focus on sport today. So let's look at the Olympic Stadium. The legacy for sport really centred around the stadium itself. The bid document, if you look at it, promised conversion to a 25,000-seat multi-purpose venue with athletics at its core. It will become a house of sport with training facilities, offices and sports science and sports medicine facilities. In fact, as we all know, the Olympic Stadium is home to West Ham United Football Club and a few other bits as well. Deputy Mayor, do you think Londoners should be content that the principal physical sporting legacy of the world's greatest multi-sport event is a football stadium, when London already has 6 other Premier League grounds plus Wembley Stadium?
Well, we could absolutely take not just the rest of the 2 hours, but the next 2 weeks discussing the stadium.
Or several hours reading this very good book as well.
Well, I mean, I think that I'm not going to receive any payment for this, but I absolutely say to everyone they should read that. Yeah. They should read that book for an awful lot of the history about what behind where London ended up with on the stadium. I was perhaps a bit of an outlier at the, and always have been on that issue. That I absolutely accept the rationale that people made for the decision, and that the argument that it would be an empty dust bowl if it had been 25,000 seat stadium, as it had athletic stadium, as had been the intention in the Legacy Community Scheme that had been adopted in about 2007. I'm a bit of an outlier because I think it could have been made to work with imagination. It wasn't going to be just left in isolation like you see in some legacies around the world, where legacies in inverted commas, where you do get these abandoned facilities on the outskirts. We could have had development platforms around there. You know, there are people have raised issues about, oh well, the wind issues because it wouldn't have had. Well, no, that I think that could have been sorted, and we could have had a different legacy. But I am I absolutely put my hands up that I am a absolute minority in this view, and that and it was justifiable, the decisions that were made. I mean, I always remember it when it happened. It's sort of about 2011, 10, 11-ish, when it was the superstructure, the white superstructure rising up out of the ground. And as soon as that was finished, it was at that point that people said, oh, we can't tear that down. Yeah. And that was what caused the problem, because I think particularly for the government, at the time, the new government, I don't think they wanted to be seen to be the people who said, no, that wasn't the plan, it's got to come down. That allied with the uncertainty that everyone else had about the 25,000-seater option, it went down that road. And once it was going down that road, it was a buyer's market.
Yes,
because it was only ever going to be Leyton Orient, not really, Spurs or West Ham. And Spurs said, well, we're interested in the location, but not that stadium, we'll tear it down. So it failed the previous test. So you had only one single interested tenant. And that's how we got where we are today.
Quite right, thank you. Could I come to Lyn now? Because obviously West Ham receives an effective subsidy on each home match. It pays a fixed rent, but E20 is liable for most match day expenses and has responsibility for life cycle and maintenance costs. And if we look at the year 21-22, E20 made a loss of £31 million. And in the same year, West Ham played 27 home matches. So you could say matchday subsidy is over £1.14 million. Obviously, there are other ways of calculating it as well, but that's a huge loss to the taxpayer. Now, Boris Johnson, as Mayor of London, when he moved to this plan that they would rent the stadium, as it were, he stated the plan to rent out the stadium as a very good deal for the taxpayer. So, Lyn, do you share the former Mayor's view that this whole setup is a good deal for the taxpayer?
I think it would be very difficult to say it's a good deal for the taxpayer, frankly. Having said that, we're dealing with something that was signed quite a number of years ago now. Many of the people in this room, if not all of them, were not responsible and were not even around at the time. I do want to come to the figures though, Caroline, because you're quoting from the published accounts, and there are a couple of clarifications there. The way we monitor what happens in the stadium are twofold. One is the operating cost of the stadium, so the cost of running the operation, which in 1920, which is the fairest way of looking at this because it was the last proper year that one can look at it, because the operating cost has been up and down in 20 and 21. In 1920, that figure was £17 million loss, operating loss. The bigger number that gets added onto it includes the cost of borrowing to facilitate that operating loss and any capital investment that has gone in that year. So 17 million would be the number to compare with an operating loss. Difficult to compare with 2020 because all football was behind closed doors. And so we had quite a good operating, we still had an operating loss, but it was a lot smaller.
Better,
you
yes,
remember
yes.
we came here and spoke about it.
Yeah.
In 2021, we had some football behind closed doors and some happening with crowds, mostly with crowds, but we didn't have any concert income, and we had to compensate UK Athletics for not coming, and they went to Birmingham in the end. So that was also an anomaly year. The next best comparator on the operating costs is therefore going to be 22-23. And it is going in the right direction. We have had challenges with match day costs because of fan behaviour, but it's going in the right direction. And I expect it to be lower than 17 million. So that's first. Okay. The reason we reported 31 million is we've put a huge amount of money, £8 million this year, into a new West Stand, which is a whole new stand in the stadium. It brings 1,700 more seats, but the key to it is it will reduce the revenue costs of moving the seats by £1 million a year. So the big number includes all the capital investment as well and the costs of borrowing, and that's why it seems so huge. So just a bit of clarity around the numbers.
Perhaps
there.
you could write to us. I think we'd
Absolutely.
all be interested with that
and
detail.
set that out, yes.
And finally, in my last couple of minutes, I wanted to come to Tanya Gray-Thompson, if I can, to talk about athletics, because the bid document promised to retain the stadium as an athletics venue. There's a tension there between football and athletics. And as we know, reconfiguration for the World Athletics back in 2017 cost 11.8 million. I know you've managed to reduce the prices now in terms of seat changes, but it's still really very complicated. But the GLA also holds the Crystal Palace Athletics Stadium, which is smaller, it needs renovation. So Tanya, do you think London in some ways will ever see that 25,000 seat multi-purpose venue with athletics at its core, or should actually the athletics legacy look at transforming Crystal Palace to sit alongside?
So as an older athlete who has very fond memories of watching and competing at Crystal Palace, it is kind of the holy grail. People still talk about it. If I go back to Olympic Park, I think it's the context of the timing of some of those decisions that were taken. There's what is expected for the Olympic Games, and at that point we're driven by what the IOC wants, not necessarily what the IPC wants. In building the main stadium, at the time there was a huge amount of disappointment that it wasn't going to be something that looked like the bird's nest in Beijing. And then all the issues about whether there was going to be a roof on or a roof off, and the decision was taken not to put a roof on to save money, but ultimately that didn't. And I think it was very easy at the time to say, yes, we will have athletics multi-use. The reality of who's going to run it and operate it and where that money is going to come from is a real challenge. So if you look at what Sydney did, is they turned their main stadium into a rugby ground, the warm-up track became the athletics track, and that didn't particularly work for them either. So we did have other examples of Olympic, Paralympic cities where they'd tried to do this. The track that's required for World Championships, Olympics, Paralympics is very expensive. It's not a training track. It's not good for training. It's not good for runners to train on. So you're weighing up lots of different things at the time. So although there might have been some decisions which weren't ideal, taking that into context with also the basketball venue. So we got criticised at the time for building a temporary basketball venue, the venue that looked a bit like a meringue. It would have been cheaper to build a permanent venue, but actually nobody wanted to run it. So the copper box was the most obvious option. So lots and lots of complicated decisions. My heart says, yes, Crystal Palace would be a great venue to redo, but that is not a simple solution to what we're trying to do for athletics. And I think if there's one thing we can learn with hindsight, is being much more creative. And nobody did it before us. No other Olympics did it before us in terms of taking that longer term view to what the park would look like afterwards. So I think there is more that we could do to think about what venues, whether we go down a German model, which is much more multi-sport than we have. There's been so many attempts in the last 40 years to do that, and the governing bodies don't buy into it. So that's potentially where government needs to step in. But this is part of a big decision about actually where do we go with the future of sport, elite sport, grassroots community, which is more than just what's happening in London.
Yeah. Thank you very